Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today centers on the really extraordinary public trajectory and, well, subsequent dramatic collapse of the image surrounding Tim Ballard. He's the founder and former CEO of the anti-trafficking organization Operation Underground Railroad, or OUR. His stature, which, was amplified dramatically by that 2023 film Sound of Freedom, it's now been entirely eclipsed by just a flood of severe legal and ethical challenges, including multiple active civil and criminal complaints. So the core controversy we need to assess is this. Does the sheer accumulation of professional critiques, alleged embellishments, and these severe misconduct claims against Ballard and OUR, does it warrant labeling the entire operation as, well, fundamentally fraudulent? Or is it maybe more accurately characterized as an organization whose legitimate mission was ultimately subverted by its founders' grave personal misconduct and just a catastrophic failure of governance? I'll be arguing that the organization's foundation and operations were systematically compromised, possibly fraudulent, really from the outset.
And I guess I come at it from, a slightly different angle. While the alleged misconduct is undeniably severe, deeply disturbing, the source material does suggest OUR's stated core mission was actually legitimate, to operate where traditional government agencies were perhaps limited by jurisdictional restraints. So I believe the organization's downfall is more of a classic example of a valuable mission being subverted by a founder's ethical breakdown, which crucially was enabled by a really catastrophic lack of structural oversight. That's a failure of governance and policy, right? Not necessarily proof of systemic fraud intended for victims or donors from day one.
I see why you'd frame it that way. Now let me offer a different perspective. The narrative of Ballard's career, it really suggests this controversy isn't some recent fall from grace, but rather the exposure of a systemic pattern. This wasn't just poor oversight. It feels more like the construction of an entire enterprise built on, well, professional embellishment and self-serving actions, and that fundamentally compromised its legitimacy. We know, for instance, that spokespeople for the CIA and DHS struggled to confirm his employment record without written permission. That alone creates an immediate foundational ambiguity, doesn't it, regarding the very expert authority upon which OUR was supposedly established. And this is compounded by the organization's persistent self-mythologizing. We have documentation suggesting alleged claims like, the denied partnership with American Airlines, the reported consultations of a psychic for mission intelligence, things like that, and the highly risky deployment of inexperienced donors on these so-called jump teams. These actions seem to prioritize image cultivation, maybe even deception, over rigorous operational practice. And crucially, this operational rot, it seems to predate the current scandal. International experts like Ann Gallagher characterized OUR's work as arrogant, unethical, and illegal as early as 2015. So when your operational methods, like the alleged couples ruse, are central to your missions and simultaneously characterized as illegal, well, that points directly to a corrupt operating structure, not just a founder who went rogue later on.
Okay, that's a compelling argument about the timeline and the early critiques. But have you considered the motivation behind the structure? Ballard left government service in 2013, and the reason given was precisely because he perceived government agencies were hampered by the mandate for a prosecutorial nexus back to the United States. So the stated goal, to gain greater operational flexibility, was, you could argue, a legitimate, if maybe unconventional, nonprofit aim. And if we actually look at the financial data, OUR did have genuine measurable impact separate from all the alleged misconduct. Their program expense ratio, it sat consistently around 71 to 72% across 2021 through 2023. Now, that figure indicates that the vast majority of donor funds were dedicated to the stated mission activities, which I think significantly undermines the claim that the entire organization was just a vehicle for financial fraud against donors from the get-go. Furthermore, the organization itself has taken steps to separate the mission from the founders' alleged behavior. Following an internal investigation, Ballard resigned in June 2023, right? And OUR immediately began significant restructuring, appointing a new CEO and, crucially, an independent board of directors. This effort suggests that the organization is capable of existing and pursuing its mission distinctly from the founders' alleged personal misconduct. It's also really important to remember that Ballard and his attorneys consistently and vehemently deny all these claims, calling them false and baseless inventions, and he has filed defamation counterclaims. The legal landscape here is highly contested, and some claims, like one sexual misconduct claim against a plaintiff, have even been dismissed in court already due to improperly accessed documents. So the legal picture simply isn't a definitive finding of organizational fraud at this point.
Okay, let's move to point one then. The weight of professional condemnation versus this idea of operational necessity. While you stress the organization's intent to bypass jurisdictional restraints, the U.S. Justice Department's 2016 warning, that's a severe professional condemnation, isn't it? The DOJ specifically advised ICAC task forces against assisting or supporting operations with OUR. This federal non-endorsement, it feels like irrefutable evidence of a profound pre-existing credibility gap with established law enforcement. It suggests their methods weren't just flexible, they were fundamentally unacceptable from a legal and ethical operational standpoint. That failure to adhere to recognized standards points to a foundational flaw, I think, not just bad management later on.
I absolutely agree. The DOJ warning is severe, yes, and it certainly demonstrates operational recklessness. But let's try to distinguish between recklessness and fraudulent intent, particularly against victims or donors. Ballard's stated goal was to operate outside existing law enforcement strictures. The DOJ warning is, in a way, the natural consequence of that very decision. It confirms a structural failure, a critical lack of necessary oversight resulting from that unilateral action, which is symptomatic of poor governance and maybe a desire for absolute control. It implies a failure to meet professional standards, absolutely, yes, but that does not inherently equate to the organization being fraudulent in its stated mission to rescue victims or fraudulent in its use of donor funds. It's a governance gap.
I'm still not quite convinced by that line of reasoning, because the alleged misconduct wasn't just some external structural oversight issue. It seems internal and allegedly central to the operational design itself. Let's look specifically at point 2. The couple's ruse and the trafficking claims. The October 2024 federal lawsuit, it alleges Ballard engaged in sex trafficking of his own female coworkers and allegedly laundered money to pay for prostitutes. The material details are frankly highly disturbing. You read about tantric yoga, practicing sexual chemistry, shared beds and showers, all allegedly justified by this manipulative question: is there anything you wouldn't do to save a child? This coercion, if it's proven true, establishes that serious misconduct and personal gain were essential to the modus operandi of the missions themselves.
When the alleged tactics actively victimize and coerce the organization's own team under the guise of rescue, well, the entire enterprise feels fundamentally compromised and fraudulent in its very execution.
Yes, and that is undeniably a horrifying set of allegations regarding personal conduct. Absolutely. However, we must constantly stress they remain allegations in an active federal lawsuit. Ballard denies them, and he's defending against them vigorously. Crucially, the organization itself addressed this internally. OUR's own internal investigation found that Ballard engaged in unprofessional behavior that violated OUR's policies and values. So the organization officially concluded a severe breach of policy and ethics. Now, while that breach is totally intolerable, the finding focuses on severe personal policy violations, which is distinct from a definitive finding that the organization itself was built to traffic its own employees or was conceived purely as a fraudulent enterprise for financial gain.
What we seem to be dealing with are policy failures that enabled severe alleged misconduct, which to me defines a mission subverted by its leader, not a fraudulent mission from the start.
But who created and sustained those policy failures? That brings us to point 3, governance as an enabler of fraud. The source material clearly states the original board consisted entirely of Ballard's relatives and close friends. Now that's more than just for oversight. It looks like a foundational organizational structure designed specifically to insulate the founder from any accountability. Court filings even allege the former board was aware of complaints but failed to act. This lack of independent checks and balances, it wasn't an accident, was it? It seems like it was a precondition for sustained misconduct and ultimately the alleged fraud.
when the system is designed primarily to protect the figurehead above the mission itself, the enterprise feels fundamentally compromised.
That's a very compelling point about the initial board structure, I agree. But have you considered the overall financial health alongside that? I would argue the lack of an independent board is clear evidence of a catastrophic governance failure. Yes, absolutely. But it's not necessarily confirmation of systematic financial fraud against the organization's beneficiaries or donors. If the governance structure was primarily intended for financial fraud, wouldn't we expect those high program expense ratios, the 71–72%, to be significantly lower? The fact that such a large portion of funds apparently did go to the mission suggests the primary intent was operational, even if it was managed recklessly and unethically at the top. Furthermore, remember the Davis County investigation into illegal fundraising? That was a separate operational complaint, and it was closed back in March 2023 with no charges being filed. So while the governance was monumentally flawed, clearly enabling the founders' alleged misconduct, it doesn't automatically confirm the entire operational enterprise was just a lie meant to defraud. And the current restructuring with the new independent board shows the organization is now at least attempting to achieve the necessary governance for a potentially legitimate future.
Okay, so to summarize my position, the evidence of systemic compromise seems overwhelming, and it predates the recent public outcry. You have the pattern of professional embellishments, the failure to even confirm his federal service clearly, the self-mythologizing narratives. Combine that with the outright professional condemnation from the Justice Department way back in 2016, and then the severity of the alleged operational coercion embedded in things like the couples ruse. It all combines, I think, to paint a picture of an enterprise that was fundamentally compromised from very early on. The structure and the methods seem driven by self-serving motives and image cultivation rather than genuine mission integrity.
And to reiterate my perspective, the sheer complexity of the legal proceedings, you've got active lawsuits, but also strategic denials, counterclaims, some dismissals. It prevents us, I think, from concluding wholesale organizational fraud at this stage. OUR did maintain positive financial metrics, suggesting funds were largely dedicated to its stated cause. So the tragedy here, perhaps, is not that the mission itself was fraudulent from the beginning, but that a critical, catastrophic lack of independent oversight allowed the founders' severe alleged personal misconduct to completely subvert what was, for many people involved in donating, seen as a legitimate and valuable mission. It really looks like a story of subversion enabled by a total governance collapse.
Well, we certainly leave the audience with the complex task of assessing the true intent behind such a public and, frankly, polarizing figure and the organization he founded, especially given the very active legal landscape and the deep cultural divisions surrounding all this material.
Indeed, there is clearly much more to explore in this material as these cases continue to develop. Thank you for this rigorous discussion today.